Hello, everybody, and welcome to Digital Hammurabi. Thank you all for joining us on this lovely Saturday morning. We have Kyle Jordan here to talk to us about ancient Egypt and disability, and I am really excited because, as with most things Egyptological, it's not something I know anything about. So I'm going to learn something, and hopefully you all will learn something too. So Kyle, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure.
Oh no, I'm like I said, very excited. This is going to be fun.
Uh,
So just to kind of kick off, can you introduce yourself and explain how you got into the field?
sure thing. So, as Megan said, my name is Carlos Jordan. I'm currently a postgraduate student at University College London, reading the archaeology and heritage of Egypt and the Middle East. How I got into the field. So, the shortest story I can really give is that when I was a very, very young boy, my dad was in the army and we moved around a lot. And during our last big move, we moved from Harrogate, which is in North Yorkshire in the United Kingdom, and we moved from there to a little town called Launceston, or Lanston as the locals call it, in Cornwall. And as we were moving, the school that I was leaving was just starting this little course that they did for 6-year-olds at the time on ancient Egypt. And as I arrived at the new school, they had just finished. 6-year-old Kyle was absolutely
No!
like heartbroken. Yes, and I was adamant that he must learn what he missed. He must know these secrets that he had missed. So after a lot of protest and a lot of hunger to know more, his parents, along with his uncle Peter, bought him the book Egyptology that was edited together by a woman called Emily Sands. You may have seen it, this big gold book with the winged Horus on the front. It was a very popular children's book at the time, still is, still gets printed and sold
I
today.
think I think I had a copy of that
Mm,
actually.
a lot of us did. And yes, so I started there and I was just sucked in ever since. And from there I kind of really developed a love and appreciation for history and archaeology, and that just didn't ever seem to fade or go away. I think when I was younger, because of just the situation I was in, I have cerebral palsy, so I use a manual wheelchair, which you can see in the background there. I didn't do a lot of the things that kids would usually do, least of all because Cornwall is one of the most impoverished counties in England. It's a beautiful place. If you ever visit, I can fully recommend it, but it's very impoverished. So not many opportunities to get out and go and do things. So I spent most of my time reading and doing other kind of searching on the internet. I was a part of that generation where like using Wikipedia was still a relatively new thing and you just don't jump in, read article after article. So that's how it went going. Now skip forward a few years and we get to what are called A levels in the UK, and I did history, government and politics, and English language. And I did those courses because I was aiming to get on to do history, and particularly ancient history and Egyptology at university. And so I had a look at the courses that were available for me to study, and ancient history and Egyptology, which was a dual honours bachelor's at UCL between the history department and the Institute of Archaeology, was onto the top of my list. Not least of all because when I was 10, I decided I wanted to be the director of the British Museum. And obviously, right next door to University College London in Bloomsbury is the British Museum. So that's just decided it for me. And that's where I've been ever since. I completed my BA and now on to my postgraduate studies. And here we are.
That is a wonderful story, and I love that 10-year-old Carl decided he would one day rule the British Museum. That
still,
is
still, still going there.
still the
Still
plan. That's
going for it.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Love it. Absolutely. Well, hopefully in like 5-6 years we'll have you back on to talk about all your planned changes after you've been
Oh
instated
yes.
in your position of leadership.
Many,
That
many
would be
changes.
wonderful. Well, thank you for that. And that is, I feel very bad for 6-year-old Carl. That's quite heartbreaking to leave one school as they're starting Egyptian history and to arrive at
Yep.
another as they finish it. It's like,
Yeah.
because like that's the best bit, at least for me as a kid in the UK. The ancient history was the best part. I mean, let's
Yeah.
be honest.
Oh yeah, it was. It's like there's a reason why they give it to you so young, because you're so eager just to sink your teeth into anything. And I think obviously, because what they did, I don't know if it was similar for you, but they start with ancient Egypt and then they do Greece and Rome, and Egypt, I think, even to a young audience, just immediately captures the imagination because on the one hand, it does feel so different, so unfamiliar. But on the other hand, you see this, and you see 5,000 years ago there were these humans in the Nile Valley doing like all these amazing, wonderful things, and you're just like you're immediately sucked in. And I think I always from that because I was reading on my own, I was reading a lot about the people, about society, and about how it organized itself, and that was why I was so interested in the people, like kind of first and foremost. I mean, I am also equally fascinated in the styles of kingship and the structures of power, as it were, but my biggest kind of interest is the people themselves, from the ancient past right up until the present day, because I think it's amazing.
No, I agree wholeheartedly with you. And people who've watched the channel for a while will have heard me like talk ad nauseum about a set of letters we have from Mesopotamia, from a city in southern Anatolia, and they're from like merchant families. And I love them because they're personal letters, so you're kind of getting a window onto people's lives. But it's personal letters by people other than like the royal family. And I'm like, yes, this is real people. This is how real people lived, and it's just. Love it. Absolutely love it. So what is your particular specialization?
So my particular specialization, my broad interests encompass themes of religion, magic, and identity. But my particular specialization would be looking at the representations of and encounters with disability in the ancient worlds, particularly Egypt. So right now, as we're speaking, and for the next few months, I will be wrapping up my thesis, which is exploring the role and significance of disability and bodily difference within the pharaonic royal court. So starting from the pre-dynastic, so before the state as an idea even really kind of started to exist, how early court societies within Egypt, just as in many other places, this isn't just a phenomena that happens in Egypt alone. It seems to occur in several early court societies, like in China, in Mesoamerica, and so on. And the looking at why early pharaohs, or the kings and chiefs that would become pharaoh, why they surrounded themselves with so many different kinds of bodily difference. So you see members of the court with dwarfism, members of the court with gigantism, members of the court with cerebral palsy, like myself, and various others, which we can get onto in a little bit. But yeah, that's what I'm working on. And I think that kind of coalesced for me, firstly with the religion, magic, and identity. Again, like I said, I'm very interested in the people. And as I was doing my BA, I just became fascinated with discussions around religion and magic in particular. To give a little context, in Egypt's case, when we think of magic, the word that's it's often translated from is Heka. But Heka means power in like its rawest natural form. So in another way of thinking about it, it's the very kind of core power that everything is made of. So magic in that sense is how you I don't want to say manipulate, but how you work with that power, and how you use your other abilities to kind of I'm trying to think of the right word, coalesce with it, and so I was really interested in that and those styles of ritual and performance, and that obviously ties in with identity as well, and that just not only looks at disability, that extends to gender and just general broader sense of identity. But the disability really came around because as I was wrapping up my BA, I kind of there were two things that really kind of decided for me, no, this is what I want to do. One was that while I was always interested in it to begin with, I wasn't necessarily focusing down that path. But what really did it for me is that I was reading some literature on disabled human remains that were found in Egypt, and we'll get onto this as well later when we talk about bits of evidence. And just the way it was being written about really kind of disgusted me, if I'm being quite honest. I wasn't very happy with how it was being described or how it was being kind of approached. So I was like, no, this has to change. And I feel with my perspective as a disabled person, I could maybe help change it. The second was the passing of a friend of mine, Teresa O'Mahony, who was a postgraduate student as well at University College London. She founded the Enabled Archaeology Foundation, which is based in the UK, and they actually have a website, and I'll drop the link for you in a moment to share with the chat. And she was a very fierce advocate for disabled people within archaeology, and made a huge case for why not only disabled people could do archaeology, but why they should, and why the field should be made more accessible for them. And after her passing, I decided I wanted to write my BA dissertation along with the feelings that I said earlier. I decided I'd write it in part as a dedication to her, just to be like, look, here was a very fierce voice and advocate for disabled people in the field, and I want to do my part in one small way by showing this kind of broader picture how disability has been present in history. So my BA thesis was on a comparative analysis of approaches to ability and form in ancient Egypt and Greece. So I did a comparative study of approaches to disability in Egypt and in Greece, and it was really good. I really enjoyed it, and that's just carried on, and that's where I think I'm obviously heading.
That's really interesting. I'm so sorry for your loss, but this sounds like a fantastic way to honor her legacy. So you kind of started to touch on this. What kinds of evidence do we have for understanding disability in ancient Egypt?
So I think I'm just going to drop the link for enabled archaeology in the chat for you before I forget and prattle on about this. But yes, okay. So types of evidence. Obviously, I think we'll start with something that is obviously very particular to the field of Egyptology, which is human remains. The field of Egyptology, as I'm sure many of the viewers are familiar with in one way or another, is particularly has this wide kind of selection of bioarchaeological material, as we call it, or human remains to study, and a lot of them have over the years been found to show signs of what we would recognize as disabilities today. Unfortunately, the literature will sometimes use the word deformities or deficiencies or some other combination of words like that, but commonly speaking, disabilities. So that is one big kind of feature of evidence for us in the Egyptian archaeological record, and that has a lot of obviously scientific value, but also ethical sort of consequences that I think obviously the field is starting to talk about more, but especially when it comes around the language of disability, still hasn't had much of a kind of reckoning yet. And I think now is the time where, along with this conversation of the wider ethics of using human bodily remains, we can start thinking about the language as well. But beyond that, the other forms of evidence that we can often find are representations in art and form. Contrary to what often gets said about Egyptian art in particular, but the same is true of Greco-Roman art, this idea of a beautified, perfect form that is embodied in wall art or in statuary or upon stele isn't really true, because you find many cases of bodily difference in these records. For one example, some of the earliest art of human figurines in Egypt, which I'm working with for my thesis, these small ivory statuettes. Mine that I'm working with are from the Petrie Museum of Egyptian Archaeology, and they are from Deir el-Balas, but there is also a wider selection of them that were buried in the Hierakonpolis main deposit, which comes from Hierakonpolis, which is in Upper Egypt, so the City of Kings. It's basically, to the Egyptians, it was known as Nekhen, and this is kind of where kingship is believed to really coalesced. So the Hierakonpolis main deposit is a burial beneath the Temple of Horus, and along with the Nama palette and other very big important objects that show the emergence of kingship and representations of wild animals and this kind of natural chaos which the king is supposed to kind of bring order to, or bring a balance of order to, I should say. Natural chaos still persists in order for order to maintain itself, but for the human world, the king brings order. But along with all that, you find these small ivory human figurines, and quite a few of them show a wide variation in bodily differences. A great number of them, for example, show people with dwarfism. And what I find interesting about them, I wish I had a picture to show you, but these particular ones that I've been working with from the Petrie Museum, they all have slightly different heights and variations, except for the figurines that represent the people with dwarfism, they seem to have been very exact in their measurements. So these figurines are only like 5 centimeters tall, so they're very small, but they've clearly taken the time to carve these out properly. But it continues far beyond that. I mean, one very famous courtier, again with dwarfism, is Seneb, who was a courtier in the fourth dynasty, so the Old Kingdom. He was a courtier probably around the reigns of Khufu, and his son Jedefre, and his mortuary statue shows him with his that's the one, thank you. As you can see here, you have Seneb sat next to his wife Senetites, and then you have the two smaller individuals who are two of his children. He had three overall, that are below his legs, and you can see that they if you look at how the image is presented, you still have that kind of symmetry that comes across in most sort of portraiture. So there's he and his wife are still at equal head level, and where his children stand are where his legs, if he was of average height, would be. So there's still a parallel there. So this kind of portrait still evokes that same sort of symmetry and wholeness there. There is no kind of emphasis of any sort of lacking. Instead, he is shown fully as he is, and he is completed by everything else around it, if that makes sense. So yeah, this and we find very similar sort of representations of this carrying all the way out through the Pharaonic period, and you have this as well with other cases, such as another courtier with dwarfism, Khnumhotep. But there's also, to think of other conditions, you have the very famous Stela of Roma. Roma was a courtier who was responsible for the title he had was holder of the doors, or keeper of the doorways. So basically, he was responsible for entry and exit of a particular door space, and he is shown with polio, or what is often regarded as polio. There you go. And here he has a walking stick or a staff. This is sometimes referred to in the literature as the staff of old age, which is a very interesting concept, and that goes in literature, and we'll get onto that in a second. But here he is giving offerings to the goddess Astarte, which is obviously not a domestic Egyptian god, but one from the Levant. And he is accompanied by his wife and his child. And often this sort of this one is actually really interesting because he's making an offering to a non-Egyptian god, or what is often received in the literature as a non-Egyptian god. Some scholars will say, oh, this representation is not typical of Egyptians because he's honoring a non-Egyptian god. But if you look at him, he's very clearly styled as an Egyptian. This is written in hieroglyphs, very clearly considers himself an Egyptian. So I think that is very much just an excuse that is sometimes latched onto to say that this is an exception to the rule that is often said that, again, these forms are always perfect or always standardized to an idea of perfection. Whereas one of my kind of big wants for Egyptology is to let go of this idea that necessarily the Egyptians had a uniform idea of perfection. I don't deny that, especially in a lot of this funerary sort of archaeology, you find beautified representations of the deceased in their art. That is very much true. But I don't think there was necessarily a uniform idea of what that perfection was. And I think you do see more variation when you look more closely. And that's where we get to the literature. So I apologize, I've been rattling on for a bit. But literature is the next big thing, because if it's the biographical inscriptions in said tombs, such as in Seneb's, where we learn more about him, or in the case of literature from legal text, or literature from day-to-day life, as in the case of, we often find in places like Deir el-Medina, the workman's village, where the workmen who built Valley of the Kings and the Queens lived, but also Ostraca from like Amarna and other places. You start to get more of a picture of the variety of human life, and also as well especially as you go further into the like say into the New Kingdom and even later periods, going into the Ptolemaic and the Greco-Roman, you find a lot of you find a lot of letters, you find a lot of literature, as in a novel literature, so satirical sort of works, or kind of great epics, and these often portray or feature or mention at least characters or embodiments of difference, as I've kind of actually discussed before well, not on your channel, but as a part of the Ancient History Day when I spoke about disability in Egyptian literature and myth, and I will drop that link as well, so that people can watch that in their own time. But yeah, and one particular piece of literature that I'm always struck by, and I talk about it in this video as well, that I've just linked, is the instructions of Amenemhotep, because it's one that often really comes up a lot when discussing disability or bodily difference in ancient Egypt in particular, because there's one particular chapter, chapter 25, where Amenemhotep, to give some clarification, is a scribe who's given instructions to his son on how to live a just and pious life. This is around a turn within Egyptian kind of religious thought, where the idea of personal piety really starts to take hold within society, because as society has grown, and as access to religious material has become more, what is often referred to in the literature as democratized, this what's often called as the democratization of the dead, because more and more people are becoming mummified and getting buried in their own tombs. He is instructing him on how to be a pious person, ready for this kind of to live a pious life, so that therefore in his final transition he can have a just eternity in the afterlife. And in this chapter 25, he mentions that you shouldn't err at a blind man, or bully a person who is physically disabled. It's often translated as cripple, which again is very much something that is a modern kind of imposition of what the word may have meant, but such as what it is. But yes, things like that. It's basically telling him, don't pick on those who are different from you. And this is often taken at face value to say, well, clearly, therefore, the Egyptians felt you shouldn't hassle the disabled. And I think obviously that is true in the case of what Amenemhotep is trying to tell his son. And the fact that this text is often used to educate young scribes on how to read and write hieroglyphics. So it is clearly one that I think culturally would have been recognized. However, it is worth bearing in mind that if they have to tell them not to do these things, that probably infers that it's likely that it did happen on the odd occasion. And so yeah, I think and this again carries out throughout the literature. And so that way, when you consider all these things in tandem, you get a really kind of diverse picture about life in the past for everyone, but especially if you're looking for more exact instances of disability, you start to see a very, very kind of nuanced picture, I think.
Thank you. That's actually an awful lot more evidence than I had assumed would be existing. That's really, really interesting. And does the evidence that you have vary significantly by time and place, or is it spread relatively evenly throughout Egypt and Egyptian history?
So that's very interesting as a question. And when you first let me know this is going to be part of the question, I was kind of like, I don't know. But I thought about it, and I think, like, on the surface, I think you can see a lot of, I don't want to say continuity, but you do see a lot of recurring sort of evidence. So again, in terms of bodily forms, again, courtiers with dwarfism are prevalent throughout most of Egyptian history, right up until the Ptolemaic period. After that, the Romans, of course, because Egypt becomes a province. There is no real court anymore for at least in Egypt, of course, for people with dwarfism to continue. But even so, they continue in religious spaces as dancers for the gods. But one thing that obviously does change, I think, is obviously the cultural attitudes that shift when you move from the pharaonic period, broadly speaking, into the Ptolemaic and Roman period, because then a lot of our sources, as is often the case throughout history, a lot of our sources, particularly the literary sources, come from contexts which would often be phrased as elite contexts. So these are contexts in which you are seeing mostly just the top strata of society. You're not really getting an idea of, the broader kind of corpus of human day-to-day life, which you sometimes see in material culture, which I should have mentioned as well. Of course, one other big evidence we have, if I can just go back quickly, is medical aids and prostheses. I mentioned the staff of old age. We do have a lot of sticks and staffs and staves, but we also have prostheses, which has been written about quite extensively by an amazing scholar called Dr. Jane Draycott. They actually have a book called Prostheses in Antiquity, which I can recommend. It's a very comprehensive kind of summary of various bits of prostheses, and we get quite a few from Egypt, for limbs, for missing arms or legs or even toes. The toe prostheses are actually quite well known, because of just how amazing they are. But you also have glass eyes, you also have false teeth, things like that. But yes, but one thing that does change, like I was saying, was the cultural attitudes. And actually, one interesting case study of this is a man which Dr. Jane Draycott has also written about as a case study from Roman Egypt, is a guy called 𝑀 Gemellus Origenes. And 𝑀 Gemellus Origenes was a disabled, blind man who lived in the Fayum area of Egypt, so kind of like the middle, just south of the Delta, Middle Egypt as it sometimes gets known. And he was a landed person. He had inherited a considerable amount of wealth from his father, who was a Roman cavalryman, and so had quite a bit of estate from that. However, he and we know of him, sorry, I should say, because his family archive, which his father started, contains all these letters and petitions that he wrote. Now, he wrote petitions. He wrote 4 of them, because he was essentially being harassed, first by his neighbors, then by a tax collector, and then finally by the village elders. And so he wrote these petitions to various members of the Roman administration in Egypt. This was around the 2nd century AD. And he is basically complaining that they are doing this to him because he is disabled. That is kind of the first thing that he always says in his petitions. He's making the point that his neighbors, who are stealing his crops and who are cursing him and his workmen so that they won't continue to reap the crops, which is important because that's how he pays his taxes. He complains about them, and then he complains about a tax collector who he alleges, because he is blind, targeted him and his elderly mother and broke down all his doors and physically abused them. And then finally, he's petitioning one of the Roman kind of regional officials to exempt him from a kind of public service that the elders of his community have exacted upon him. I will put a link to the paper in the chat, which is freely downloadable, and you can read it at your own pace. But yeah, so he makes all these petitions, and so we get a good idea of like his, or at least a fraction of an idea of how he's living his life. Now, it's interesting to note that he himself was his father, like I said, was Roman, but his mother was not. She was a local. So even though he claims Roman citizenship, as would be his right as inheriting his father's status, it's an interesting how a combination of that perhaps and his disability maybe led to this maltreatment, as he seems to allege as well. And the fact that he is petitioning, I think, is a reaction to his own understanding of his embodiment, that he sees himself as a Roman citizen, so these are the legal recourses that he is allowed to take. And I think it's interesting because it shows how many different things factor into how a person is treated. So quite often when they talk about disability in antiquity, or when I say they, I mean scholars in general, and in a broader corpus of things, those that have written about it, they often focus solely on the disability. And obviously, while the disability does play a key part, I strongly feel like you must consider the wider kind of scope of their embodiments and consider how that factors into it as well. So in Gaius Commerce's case, he is, like I said, he's a Roman citizen, but not necessarily by his own. He has inherited that status from his father. In the same way as, to use another example from a much earlier period, as a woman who I've talked about many times, and I've got another talk that I will link to, a woman known as 𝑒̱hēsēt, who lived in the 18th century, so just at the end, BCE, that is, just at the end of the 13th dynasty, and she was a courtier in the court at what was called 𝑒̱hēsēt, which was the capital, also around the Fayum area, but she is buried in Thebes. And what's interesting for her case is that there's possibility that she was actually Nubian from birth. So she had obviously potentially migrated either in her life, or her parents had migrated, one or the other. But here she is now in a very high status position. She was married to a court judge. And so she was a part of the royal court. And when we think of the royal court, it's not just a fixed physical space. It's actually more like a social network. So you are kind of part of the king's own social sphere, social life. You maintain his or her kind of needs beyond just the immediate kind of political sort of roles that are often thought of when we think of courts, when we think of viziers and treasurers and stuff. So here we have another case of a much earlier case, obviously, of a foreigner by all accounts, but clearly on the obverse, she is not treated or seen as different or as a foreigner. In fact, what we do know of her is the fact that she was buried in Thebes, in the Theban necropolis of Dra Abu al-Nagar, and she's one of the earliest burials there. And that burial place becomes a recurring burial place for other high status individuals, including a future pharaoh from the Second Intermediate period, 𝑁𝑒𝑚-Kheperre-Intef. The pyramid that he built is actually quite clear near to hers. And what you have to bear in mind with Egyptian burials in particular is that the tomb becomes their body. They become part of this sacred landscape that exists on the western side of the Nile. So when you're thinking about these individuals in life as in death, you have to consider those factors that were kind of played part of their embodiment in death, and that also kind of gets forgotten. So she was clearly a very high status woman. Now again, both of them, it should be noted, to a greater or lesser degree, were people of status. That needs to be factored in to their lived experiences as well. The experiences of someone in either of their position without those is quite off. Well, start again. Sorry. The status of people in either of those positions with the same embodiments, so either blindness, or in the case of 𝑒̱hēsēt, I should have said, has cerebral palsy, so like myself, would have been quite different potentially. And it comes back to the teachings of Amenemhotep, where he says you shouldn't jeer at these people. They probably did. And actually, Dr. Drain Draycott's article on Roman Egypt actually has a bit at the end about analysis of public humiliation as a kind of common feature of society at the time, and going back into the late Roman Republic. So yeah, there are so many different factors that come into it, and I think it only magnifies as you go through time, because all these different things are changing, society changes, and so therefore does the organization of people's feelings around those differences, I think.
Thank you. And I think that's an excellent point that is worth stressing here. People have like very varied facets of themselves which play into how they are treated by others, and picking out one and focusing on it to the exclusion of all others, I think probably leads to a very one-dimensional understanding of a human society. I'm going to take a brief pause. People watching, if you have questions for Kyle, please do put them in the chat. I have 2 more questions of my own, and then we'll go to audience questions for as long as the babies will let us talk. So get them in there. Make sure you tag me at Digital Hammurabi. Super chat questions, as always, will have priority. So if you have a question, whack it in the chat and we'll get to it if we have time. So you've covered this a little bit, but I thought maybe we could have a bit more space to hear about it. What kinds of disability can be identified in the historical record?
So that is an interesting one, and that comes back to what I was saying about the types of evidence we have. So in some cases, we obviously do have the benefit of human remains, which can be examined to give a diagnosis. So in the case of 𝑀₂, as I explained in the talk that I give, we do actually have her remains, and so there has been a sensible study of her remains, and the diagnosis for ataxic cerebral palsy was given. So we have examples of that, examples of polio as well, as I mentioned earlier with the case of Roma, and a lot of these other diagnoses sometimes do come from kind of interpretations of art instead, because in the case of Seneb, we do not have any human remains. So, and it should always be noted as well. I think Dr. Zonia Sakruski has. I may have butchered that last name. I apologize, Sonia, if you're in the chat. But she has written an excellent paper just last year about the challenges with bioarchaeology and the study of kind of human populations through just the funerary kind of archaeology alone, by the human remains alone, because the buried remains will only ever be a very small cross section of the entire society, and quite often they also have their own biases. Again, who is being buried and for what. But anyway, so you get these examples of people with cerebral palsy, polio. You have obviously dwarfism is one that I'd mentioned. Like I said, in a lot of early graves, we have examples of gigantism. Limb loss, obviously, is something that appears within the archaeological record, particularly as you go into. I mean, it's prevalent throughout history, but you do see an increase of limb loss or loss of eyes or noses or ears or things like that during the very heightened kind of violent periods of, say, like the conquests of Alexander and the wars of his generals after the fact, or even, obviously the kind of late Roman Republic into the Roman Empire. These kind of very violent, turbulent periods, especially when you're considering as well the embodiment and nature of slavery. Um, when you're getting into the Greco-Roman periods, it's always important to remember the kind of the role that slavery plays in those societies, and the mutilation of bodies in that practice, how that plays into it as well. So yeah, a very broad section of physical disabilities. Now, I saw in the chat someone asked about mental disabilities or learning or intellectual disabilities. Now, that one is a bit harder to determine because that doesn't really leave a direct trace in the bioarchaeological record. You do have texts that talk about people who are, like, in the text, a word will talk about having the intelligence of a child or things like that, but it's very hard to kind of read between the lines and know for sure if they are referring to someone who may be intellectually disabled in a very derogatory way. Of course, this is not a very kind way to talk about them, or it is just the case that they are, like I mentioned earlier, with the public mockery, whether they are just trying to brandish this person with a conceived negative trait, regardless of whether they actually had it or not. But that being said, you do definitely get themes of that in literature. And speaking of Egyptian literature more broadly, there is one particular story that I'm very fond of, which is the dialogue or conversation between a man and his bar. The bar is a representation of one key part of the Egyptian soul. This is kind of your purest essence. This is who you are. Kind of almost like your conscience in a way, if you think about it, is one way of thinking about it. And the man and his bar are basically having a dialogue with each other because the man simply doesn't want to live anymore. So sometimes the inferredness is that he is suicidal, but it could also be a more kind of, it could even go beyond that. But anyway, he's having this dialogue and he's saying he doesn't really see the point in living anymore. To which the bar kind of convinces him, no, you're not. This isn't your time to die, essentially. And that a peaceful death is better than an unpeaceful one. And so and there's a longer dialogue than that. It's a wonderful story. I can totally recommend giving it a read. And so there are kind of lines that you can read where it shows that there is a sense of mental illness and mental difference as well. And especially as we go into later periods, talking about Greek kings or Roman emperors, there are some inferredness as to whether they had learning disabilities, but again, that comes with the fact of the authors, who are they writing about, and for what reason. So you should always be cautious as to what extent. But it would have likely been present, because it's been present throughout human history, as it is today. So it is something worth thinking about. So yeah, but a very broad section of disabilities. And finally, just to wrap up, it's worth bearing in mind that disability as a construct has this very clear societal element to it as well. This is very true for the modern kind of inference of disability, which we will get on into in a minute. But some examples of disabilities, or what would be considered disabilities in the ancient world, particularly in the context of, say, a place like Egypt, just to give one example, would be things like infertility. Infertility in a culture where the whole cycle of life and the cycle of fertility is really, really important, would have been really detrimental to a woman's kind of lived experience. And it's always been something I've wanted to kind of look into more, because I think it's something that often doesn't necessarily get overlooked. It's certainly been considered before, but then never gets a real solid focus. So, but yeah, there are texts that infer that an infertile woman is not a dangerous one, but obviously there's something bad has happened if a woman is infertile. And likewise, if a man is considered infertile as well, and there's all sorts of differences there, but the emphasis is definitely put on women in that instance, especially in Egypt's case. So yeah, there is a very broad section that you could consider as disabilities, and I think that's why sometimes you use the phrase bodily differences, because there's such a wide cross section.
Thank you. And that kind of leads into the last question I have. And I think I heard a baby cry, so I'm going to ask the question and then leave.
Sure, no worries.
You keep talking. How was the ancient Egyptian understanding of disability different or similar to our own?
So, right, this gets into what I was just saying. So if you think about today, when we speak about disability, a concept that often comes up is something called the social model of disability. This, in contrast to what's called the medical model. The medical model espouses that the individual is the one responsible for their own disability, because it is on them and their body or mind, and that they need medical treatment to be fixed, essentially, that this is something bound to the person. Whereas the social model of disability espouses an idea whereby it is not the person with their impairment, so there's a separation of impairment and disability. The person and their impairment is not the one kind of responsible for their own struggles in life. It's in fact the societal barriers that exist, that are created either because of direct negligence, so what's called disableism, or indirect negligence, so ableism, so the idea that, oh, that's just the way it is, so they can't possibly do these things. And it's those barriers, both man-made, well, they are all man-made, but they're either a process of thinking about it, and in a conceptual way, and then obviously in like things like the design of physical space. So the fact of the lack of access, ramps or level access to buildings, just as one very arbitrary example, is a case of the social model. It's not that the person can't. It's not the person's fault for being unable to get into the building. It's the fact that the designers of the building didn't think to include them. Now, as this pertains to the ancient Egyptians, now this was part and parcel of my BA thesis, because again, I was doing a comparative analysis of approaches between Egypt and Greece. My conclusion there, and it still, I think, holds up with my feelings towards it now, is that the Egyptian kind of approach to disability has tinges of the social model within it, or what we would recognize as the social model. But it's important to bear in mind that the social model was created in a very specific context and time. In this case, it was written in the 1980s by a man named Michael Oliver, and it was developed as a response to the neoliberalization of the economy under Thatcher and Reagan and those sorts, and the idea of benefits and social welfare, and the kind of the challenges that arose from those changes to those things. So this doesn't necessarily correlate directly to the ancient past. It doesn't mean it doesn't have any value to the ancient past, but this idea of disability as being purely a societal barrier doesn't necessarily match up, because again, as I said earlier, disability is a constant human embodiment throughout human history. So you have to think of disability in a more broader sense, and there are more models that explain these things. And in Egypt's case in particular, there is a thing that is sometimes referred to as the religious model or the moral model of disability, which is the idea that disability is something inherent because of the intervention or because of the kind of action of gods or divine powers, or basically something not man-made, something that is beyond human comprehension. And in Egypt's case, again, thinking back to the to the literature I mentioned, so the wisdoms of, or the instructions, sorry, of Amenemhotep. As part of that as well, he has this kind of carrying on where he says, man is straw and clay, that we are malleable constructs, basically, is what he's telling his son. I mentioned this in the talk I gave on Egyptian myth and literature for Ancient History Day. So I think that from what my analysis of that and of, say, all the pieces of evidence that I mentioned, I think Egyptians had a very malleable idea as to what the body actually was. And so in that case, I think disability, as we would recognize it today, to them, for the most part, was something that was just part and parcel of a life. So they had this very moral attitude towards it, that because of the cycle of life and death that existed in their worldview, deterioration of the body, either from birth or as a consequence of life, was just something that carried on regardless, and that it was something that you just had to deal with because that was what the gods designed. Now, of course, there are kind of exceptions to that, and that's where the social model does come in. I mentioned the staff of old age earlier. Now, that is actually something that not only exists as an object, but exists as a concept, because when you say that someone takes upon the staff of old age within tomb inscription or funerary literature, that means that they've reached a point in their life where they are in need of further assistance, usually through the use of a physical aid, or in the case of, say, their children coming to help them. And this is an element of the social model because it recognizes that the society has to take on the responsibility of supporting the person. And in this case, for the Egyptians, it's important because that act of care is important to maintain the sense of order that society requires in order to persist, and so that things don't fall into disrepair. And you see this as well, and I mentioned this in my talk on Egyptian myth and literature, recur constantly in themes of Egyptian myth. So the idea of, say, the sun god Ra, when he gets old in the myth of the heavenly cow and he refuses to abdicate, that is a bad thing because he is no longer fit and able to continue the role of king, and his negligence leads to the suffering of the Egyptian people when he has Hathor turned into Sekhmet, and she gets a bloodlust and she starts killing people wantonly. And so therefore, the moral of the story is that you have to take your leave when it's time. And so quite often when you see literature mention the staff of old age, it's them saying, okay, I can't do this anymore, I'm going to pass it on. And it's important to know as well that when we say staff of old age, it doesn't mean a fixed sort of retirement age like we have today. It's simply just a moment when the body has said enough, or the mind, I guess, has said enough. So, old age could be as soon as 30 years old in some cases, so it's all about that transition and marking those transitions. So there is a social element to it, excuse me, but there is still that element of moral, religious sort of feelings towards it. And this also applies in instances where Egyptians were very anxious, which is in the case of bodily fluids is actually one very interesting case study of that, because Egyptians felt that all fluids of the body, as in all fluids of the world, in fact, came from the same source, from the source of none, the eternal primordial waters from which we all emerged in the beginning. So any excess of those fluids was seen as potentially quite potent and quite dangerous. And this actually comes up with the case study of 𝀭₀ that I mentioned, because she had ataxic cerebral palsy. One of the side effects of ataxic cerebral palsy, and we know this from her human remains, is that there was a buildup of saliva in one side of her mouth because she just had an excess of it and couldn't necessarily swallow it all the time. And any excess of saliva, which we know from medical papyri, was seen as quite potent, quite dangerous, and needed to be cleared. They needed to clear that airway, and it probably obviously had the medical benefits of obviously making sure that was clear and making it easier to speak and to eat. But it also serves a very social, magical purpose, because you are curtailing those chaotic waters by caring for this person, and therefore bringing balance back to the body, and therefore the wider kind of social space that they are inhabiting. So rather than rejecting her because of this difference that she had and because of this anxiety that it would have likely caused, they proactively sought to care for her as a result. And what I say in the talk I gave about her is that I believe she was also consciously aware of this, and this played into her role as a member of the royal court. Because going back to my thesis, one of the many reasons why kings, not just in Egypt but around the world, bring in people with bodily differences and disabilities within their courts is this act of care. It's showing a degree of power and a degree of responsibility to say, I am going to help care for this person. But the person themselves isn't just a one-sided person in that. They're not just someone who's sitting there and letting this happen to them, of course. They are consciously aware of this transaction that's going on. So they would have found their own ways to garner power, influence, what have you. And in the case of Seneb, going back to him, he was a very influential courtier. He has several thousand herds of cattle, which he might have inherited. There is that possibility as well. Because there are many other people with dwarfism buried in the same cemetery as him in the western field of Giza, which potentially could have been some relation. But the fact is that he garnered many other titles as well. So he moved through life obtaining all these other roles and stuff, likely because of his social relationships and interactions with people. Just as in the same way, Gehaset, as a married woman, as a lady of the household, as the title goes, would have had responsibilities in navigating social relationships for her and her husband throughout the royal court, both with Pharaoh but also with the wider kind of social sphere. So yeah, in sum, the idea of disability in ancient Egypt, as I reckon it to be, and I'm still working on this, but as it stands right now, I feel like there is a tinge of recognition of the social responsibility of these things, because there's a wider social responsibility to the universal sphere of life as it exists, the cycle of life as it exists in Egypt. But there is also obviously a great hint of this kind of wider moral religious implications. So yeah, that's in sum.
Thank you, Kyle. That's a very full answer. We are at the hour mark. Are you happy to answer audience questions, or would you like me to save them and I'll bring you back on and we'll do that another time?
I'm happy to keep going if you're happy to keep going, but I obviously if you need to go and care for the lovely little babies, I don't mind.
No, I am good. I am going to throw up our 30-second countdown until question time. I'm going to switch babies. So if anyone has questions for Kyle, please put them in the chat and I will be right back. If you'd like an expert to answer your questions, then make sure you join us live next time. Check out digitalhammurabi.com/calendar for details of future interviews. And remember to bring your questions. And we are back. Thank you, everybody, for your comments and for your patience. We are going to scroll up so I can find all of the questions that you've been asking. So Kyle did touch a little bit on this earlier, discussing mental illnesses, but we've had a couple of questions about treatment. So do we know how people treated mental illness, or is that something that is not really present?
So we don't get much indication, because a lot of medical papyri that we get are focused on the body, because physicians primarily focused themselves on things like broken bones or on difficulties with, like I said, bodily fluids and things like that. A lot of Egyptian medicine, more broadly speaking, isn't focused on like a Hippocratic style of fixing things as we often think. It's more of a case of setting to a standard where they can heal and move on, if that makes sense. So there was no kind of temple uniform standard. It was more about making sure the ailment itself was remedied. That's the word I was looking for. So there's more of a remedy. In terms of mental illness, there's nothing that's coming to my mind in terms of Egyptian literature. I know that in Greco-Roman literature there is sort of themes of kind of disturbedness in people who may be showing signs of mental illness, and in that case, there is a degree of social exclusion in that, but there hasn't been nearly enough written upon that to really make any sort of conclusions either way. I think it's going to need a lot more closer sort of reading, and importantly, as I think is true of all these things, I think it needs a reading from a point of view that understands these things. Because I think if you understand these things more, you have a propensity to pick up on things that others might miss, or to understand the nuances maybe of something else that is going on within the text. But yeah, not in terms of treatment, not that I know of.
Oh yeah. A similar question also, do we have evidence of spells or medical texts that try and like remove or heal disability?
So this is the interesting thing. Now in literature, there are spells that are mentioned within myth that are supposed to. One very common example is in the contendings of Horus and Set. At some point during their scuffle, Set takes out both of Horus's eyes, and with the help of, in some variations of the text, you have Tot, the god of wisdom, or in other cases you have his own mother, Isis. They help to restore his eyes, but it's made very clear that obviously these are gods doing this, so their power is a bit greater than that of humans. But more importantly, these aren't the same eyes that he had. These are new eyes, entirely new. Again, coming to this idea of remedy, you can't restore what has already been taken away, and in fact the eyes become something entirely new and different altogether, but they can give new ones. For the case of medical texts of individuals, no, there is no kind of insinuation that there is any need to, again, like I said, heal these people. What they do instead is quite often they will give like I said, a prosthesis or a suitable replacement for this feeling of wholeness. But it is interesting to note that the prostheses that I mentioned, in all the prostheses that we currently found buried with human remains, they exist with people who lost their limbs in life. We can tell because you can see where the limb was cut. This isn't true for people who were born without that limb. So clearly there was this idea that if someone was born a particular way, that was obviously how they were possibly supposed to be born. So thinking of Gehaset, one thing I mentioned in the talk I gave about her is that one of the reasons we know that she had ataxic cerebral palsy is because she shows hypermobility in her joints. We can see this because in her, I believe it was left wrist, we can see the flesh that is actually fused around the joint. And by analysis of that joint and that flesh, we can tell that that wasn't a case of post-mortal deformation, because otherwise you would have seen a very clean break in the flesh and in the skin. So this is something that her arm naturally rested in, basically. And it stands to reason, and I think it always got overlooked, and this is something I've tried to point out since. If they wanted to fix that, if they wanted to heal it, if they wanted to take it to a normative standard, they could have easily done that. They could have easily fixed it into a place that is perceived as normal, but they didn't. It was very deliberately left alone, and I think that's an active choice that was taken in the post-mortem process that doesn't often get acknowledged. So yeah, that's that. So there is no real, basically, there's no insinuation of healing disabilities. There is caring and remedying, but no sort of healing. idea, really.
Thank you very much. And this may not be one we can answer, but do we have any idea what percentage of people survived losing a limb or becoming disabled?
No, not really. And again, this comes back to the issue that I raised earlier. It's very hard to create a very accurate demography of the ancient past when, again, the often the human remains that you're working with are only representing a fraction of the population. So there's only so much you can extrapolate from that. You do find people with, like I said, lost limbs and things. So it's clearly something that is survivable. The same with developing disabilities through life. Again, I think the staff of old age, that analogy shows that there was this kind of that shows there was this recognition that there was need for care when things change, and there was an active move towards that in day-to-day life. But as to in terms of accurate percentages, no, none that none that we can really speak of, and I don't think that's something we will ever be able to say with any certainty. At the very least, it'll only be a fraction of a percentage of a percentage, you know. So yeah, it's not really easy to say.
Thank you. Next question is about pharaohs. How disabled typically were the pharaohs? The viewer has heard stories about King Tut, who was unable to stand, and possible glandular problems with other rulers.
So disability amongst pharaohs themselves. Now, as you mentioned, King Tutankhamun is one famous example, and it's actually an example that gets a lot of division amongst scholars. There are a very large cross section of Egyptologists that when you float the idea that King Tut was disabled, they get up in arms because he's the golden boy, he's the golden pharaoh. He can't possibly have been disabled. His injuries were either as a result of his death or some will say, oh, it was a rushing of the mummification process, which I don't buy for 1 second, because why would they have to rush something that they have not only done many times before, and the people who are tasked to do it are tasked very specifically to do it, but also it takes the same amount of time regardless of who has died. So I don't buy into the whole they rushed it and that's why his body's all mangled. It's like no, he had spinal bifida, he had all these other conditions in part because of his incestuous ancestry. So this is also part of it, as I think someone in the chat mentioned. And actually, King Tutankhamun is a really good example because we know from his tomb that they took many precautions to care for his body, both in life and in death, taking this disability in mind. One of my favorites is the fact that he actually had many walking sticks or canes, and in particular, a number of them represented the enemies of Egypt. So you have handles taking the form of Assyrians or the form of Nubians. And the idea was that he would hold on to these as he was walking and he would essentially be throttling them. And the reason why that's important is that's because one of the many things that the pharaoh has to maintain is this control of the borders, but also more importantly, he is maintaining that sort of supremacy over the enemy. And often these would actually be represented on the sandals that pharaohs wore. Sandals have a very long connection with pharaohs and their power. Just go back to the Nama palette, and the very first person you see standing next to pharaoh isn't a vizier, isn't a general, but is sandal holder. For Tutankhamun, because of his many disabilities, which my colleague Alexandra Morris, who is also disabled, has written about, and I'll get you a link in a minute for a paper that she's written on this. Tutankhamun, and we have these from his tomb as well, have sandals that were specifically made for him to be extra cushioned and wider and more secure. So they had extra straps to kind of keep them on his feet. So they couldn't really take the same traditional shape that they often did. So instead of putting the enemies on his heels, they put the enemies on his walking sticks, adapting, of course, to the reality that he would need these to get around. And this is often, again, something that gets overlooked. The Egyptians being consciously, the courtiers in particular, being consciously aware that they need to do this in order to maintain the cosmological role of Pharaoh and the roles that he fulfills. So this was a very conscious decision by them. This is very important to do, which is why they do it. And it just often gets overlooked. We have other examples. I'm afraid, right off the top of my head right now, I cannot remember his name, and I really apologize for that. but there is a pharaoh from the Second Intermediate period during these warring with the Hyksos and the dynasties of the Upper Egyptian Kingdom, who has a shortened leg, and I'm trying to think of the right diagnoses. But he basically, his mummy shows the blunt force trauma to the head. So clearly at one point the he might have suffered this blunt force trauma, and then as a result maybe had become disabled, and so therefore as a result they must have obviously had to care for him for a time before he was buried and before he was buried. Sorry. So this is something that they were accurately prepared for, and often when you're looking at the royal court and pharaohs, you are looking at the maintenance of his or her body. The body of the pharaoh is very important to this idea of the state and of power and things like that. So there was also a great deal of understanding of not only how the body worked, but how to deal with changes to the body. So I think, the likelihood of other pharaohs throughout history showing some degree of disability, or at least debility, as they get older, as is the case of quite a few pharaohs who get quite old, and then that was something that they obviously could deal with. So yes, there are cases of that as well, and like I said, I will link for you in the chat the paper by Alexander Morris on Tutankhamun and his disabilities.
Thank you. And if you are interested in looking at the walking sticks of Tutankhamun, they are actually in the video that Kyle did for Ancient History Day that we linked earlier in the discussion, and I'll put all of the links that Kyle is sending me in the video description. So if you are watching this after we finished airing, you can go back and take a look, because there's some fantastic resources to learn more about this. We are actually out of audience questions, so everybody, thank you so much as ever. Fantastic questions. Kyle, thank you so much for joining me and for being willing to talk to yourself while I run and get babies.
Not a problem. Babies are very important, very much more important than this. But no, I thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to come and talk to your lovely audience, and for letting me prattle on for over an hour about this stuff. It's
my pleasure.
It's great. There's still so much to do. As I said, I can only really give you as much of a kind of cross section of what I've worked on, but there's still so much out there and stuff that I kind of want to go on and do and plan to go on and do. And not just myself either. There are many other disabled scholars across ancient world studies who are doing this stuff. So this stuff is going to be changing quite a lot. So as we go forward, there will be more interpretation, more evidence that will come up, and we will continue to work with that. So it's very at the forefront of our questions right now. So I encourage you to keep tabs on it and to hopefully learn more as we keep going.
And there is a vibrant Twitter community. If Twittering is something that you do, I'll put Kyle's handle in the description as well, so you can keep up to date with his work and the work of many other people, including Dr. Jane Draycott, who he's referenced several times before. And Kyle, we would be delighted to have you back to talk about any future research projects anytime. Open invitation.
Oh, thank you, Megan. I would absolutely adore that. I very much enjoy what you and Josh do, and I've always admired the channel for a long time. So I've been very honored to come here and to share, as I said, and I hope we get to do more of it in the future.
Well, thank you. Audience, again, thank you so much all for joining us. There are several interviews coming up in the coming weeks. I'm talking to an author, I think, later this week, and Eli Tadmore is coming back to talk about Ezekiel and the Era Epic, which should be very interesting. If you are interested in any of those, or you want to see what our interview schedule is, you can find that on the website. That is digitalhammurabi.com/calendar. At the end of this month and during November, we have our scholarship. Sorry, baby is eating my face. We have our scholarship students returning to tell us about the research that they carried out over the summer. All of those interviews will be on the calendar as well. So please do come back and hopefully find something that you will enjoy watching. And until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Digital Hammurabi is made possible by generous sponsorship from our patrons. Their support means that we have the technological and academic resources necessary to bring the ancient world directly to you. If you want to join the team, go to patreon.com/digitalhammurabi to see how you can help.